Welcome to the first Sunday of 2021. That almost sounds weird to even say that, doesn't it? At the beginning of each year, we usually take time to review the accomplishments of the past year and look forward to the new year. It's a time to set goals, direction, and vision. Last week, as I was praying and seeking God for direction on a series to start the new year, He directed me to the book of Joshua. We're not going to be going through the whole book of Joshua, but we will be going through the first part of the book because I believe the experiences of the Israelites as they moved into the new territory that God was giving them is the vision that God's giving me for our church for this next period of time. As I read through and meditated on the first chapter of Joshua, 3 words were impressed on my mind, and those words have become the title of my message today. These words describe 3 different kinds of people and how they navigate life. We find these 3 types of people described throughout the Bible. We can find examples of these same types of people throughout history. And if we look around, it's easy to still identify these same types of people in the world and in our churches today. Each one of us is represented by one of these 3 descriptions that I'm going to give today. Truth be told, I think that most of us bounce back between these different descriptors at different points in our lives. My goal is not to point a finger at anybody or tell you which of these categories you fit into or tell you buck up and shape up or whatever. That's God's job to do that. But I think it would be great for each of us to look within ourselves and ask God, where am I currently? And am I where you want me to be? Not am I where I want to be, but as believers, we should be wanting what God wants for us. So the first group of people I want to talk about, I call the wanderers. Wanderers are really heading no place in particular. They want to be successful. They want a great life. They want to accomplish things. They kind of have a vague idea of what success looks like, but they don't have anything they can exactly put their finger on. They can't seem to commit to anything long term. These people often jump from job to job, from church to church, and unfortunately, even relationship to relationship, because they always see the grass as being greener somewhere else. They don't seem to understand that grass doesn't get green on its own. The green grass that somebody else has, the success that somebody else has, took work, dedication, and sacrifice. Wanderers want everything to come easy. They want everything to be handed to them. And even if they do get something, they can't hold on to it for very long because they didn't work to get it, and they don't want to put in the effort that it takes to keep it. Another thing I've noticed about wanderers is they're chronic complainers. They're always blaming someone else for the reason they don't have something better. That person caused all my problems. That person made poor choices, which is affecting me. If somebody would change this, everything would get better. Instead of seeking God for answers, saying, God, I'm wandering right now. I don't have any direction for my life. God, what am I doing wrong? What are your plans for me? They're always blaming somebody else because they're not at a place they want to be, but they really can't even put a finger on where it is they want to be. Sometimes they even blame God for the situation and say, God, it's your fault. You brought me here. And sometimes God does lead us somewhere to get our attention, but it's for our own good. Wandering is where we find most of the Israelites when we begin the book of Joshua. For the past 40 years, they have been traveling in circles, constantly moving, but not really going anywhere. At this point in their lives, they really don't have any goals. Their goal is just to make it to tomorrow. They're just living day to day with no thought of the future or what that's going to look like. Now, I think it's important to point out here that these people didn't choose to become wanderers on their own. This is a place where they could have said it's their fault because it was actually their parents' fault that they were wandering. Their parents made the choice for them, and they're simply doing what their parents did. 40 years earlier, Their parents had left Egypt full of promise and expectation. They were headed to a land that flowed with milk and honey. That's the way that God described it. I'm going to take you to a place where there's milk and honey that just flow. But they expected the land to be given to them without a fight. Their expectation was God was simply going to take them there and say, here, it's yours. And when they got there and figured out they were going to have to fight, and they saw who they were going to have to fight to get it, all their confidence left. They no longer wanted that because it wasn't going to be given to them easily. Even though God had promised to give them victory, they doubted that God was really strong enough to really give them the victory. They thought those giants were bigger than God. They saw how big the Canaanites were and how fortified the cities were. They said, it's too risky. It's too hard. Instead of believing in the promise of God, they actually got angry with God and for Moses for leading them to this place, for making promises that they weren't able to keep. They were sure that if they continued on the journey that God had put in front of them, they were going to be destroyed. So even though God's ultimate plan for his people hadn't changed, God decided he would bypass that generation completely. He said, if you don't really want the promises that I have for you, I'll wait. I'll let your children have those promises. You see, God's plans, God's promises don't change. God will accomplish his purposes. The question is, will his purposes, will his plans, will his promises be accomplished through us? Or will they be accomplished through someone else? So for 40 years, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness instead of taking possession of the land that God had promised them. Now, let me point out something else that I think is really important. Just because the Israelites were wandering doesn't mean that God had forgotten them or given up on them. It also didn't mean that they had given up on God. The Israelites still followed the cloud or the fire when it moved. That's what had led them out of Egypt. And they were still following the cloud. When the cloud moved, they moved. That was God moving. They were still following God. They were still his people. He was still their God. But their lack of faith and unwillingness to fight for what God promised kept them from enjoying the promise. Instead, God led them through the wilderness. God continued to feed them manna and quail every day. He kept their clothing from wearing out. He gave them water when there was no water to drink. God didn't abandon them. But they also didn't accomplish anything. They were his people, but they were going nowhere for that period of time. It's also interesting to note that even though it was God that provided manna, quail, and water to keep them alive, those things weren't intended to last forever. Joshua chapter 5 tells us that as soon as they crossed the Jordan into the promised land, the daily provision of manna stopped. Why? Because they now had access to the bountiful produce that God had promised them 40 years earlier. God said, I'm going to take you to this land. I will take care of you until you get there. I mean, really, it was him taking care of them in the new land too, but he said, I'll feed you in the wilderness. But you're not supposed to stay there. I'll give you manna, but that's not intended to be your breakfast every day for 40 years. I have something better. They could have had it much quicker, but their lack of faith kept them eating manna instead of the better that God had for them. Let's now talk about the second group of people. These are the settlers. In Numbers chapter 20, after all the doubters had died, the people are still wandering, but God begins to move them once again towards the promised land. It'll be another year before they actually cross the Jordan into Canaan. And on the way there, the Israelites encounter some nations that refuse to allow them passage. Some of the nations even come against Israel, but God gives the Israelites victory, and the Israelites easily defeat those people. They did have to fight, but God gave them the victory. In Numbers chapter 32, we read that some of the Israelites fall in love with the land that they have just conquered and want to stay there. This land was fertile. It was close to the river. It would be a perfect place to raise their cattle. It was good land, but it wasn't as good as what God had for them on the other side of the river. But they saw this land. They said, we're not sure yet what's over there. God's promised it, but what if it doesn't turn out to be as good as this? So they asked Moses for permission to settle there on the east side of the river. Moses, we assume with God's approval, because Moses never did anything without consulting God, Moses gave in and gave them the land they requested. So the second point I want to make today is, will we settle for something good when God has something better planned? Or have we settled for something good when God has something more that He wants to give us? The place they settled was okay. In fact, it was even good, but it wasn't great. They still had God's blessing. God said, if you want this, okay, you can have it. But if you're going to keep this, you're going to miss out on the better that I have on the other side of the river. How often do we do that? How often do we start out with a goal or vision and then stop halfway there? We get to a point where we say, well, this may not be exactly what I had in mind or exactly what I think God promised, but this is better than what I had. I can live with this. I'm tired of pushing. I'm tired of fighting. I think I'll just stop right here and enjoy this because this is good. I'd like to see something else, but so far that something else is a dream. This is now. This is real. Now, in the story of the Israelites, that actually didn't keep them from hard work. They wanted the land, and Moses made a deal with them. He said, okay, you can stay here, you can settle your families here, but the men have to agree to cross over and help their brothers conquer the rest of the land. If this is where you want to settle, fine, but they helped you get your possession, which you're claiming here on this side, so you're going to have to go and fight, and they agreed to that deal. So in this case, it didn't even keep them from putting in the work, but the deal was, if you settle here, you can't live there. So they had to give up the best for the good. While we're on the subject of settlers, let's fast forward 8 years. Joshua chapter 12 lists all of the nations that God helped the Israelites conquer. When we get to chapter 13, we read this in verse 1. Joshua had grown old. The Lord said to him, you are now very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. So for 7 years after getting into Canaan, they were fighting battles. They had defeated many of the nations that originally lived there. They had taken much of the land, but God's desire was them to take all of the land. So now after 7 years of fighting, God says, you've taken this much. Then in the next few verses, he lists the territories that still have not been taken. But God says, let's stop for now. Let's divide up what we've already taken. Let's go ahead and settle these areas. Essentially what he's saying is, you've worked hard to get this far. So let's enjoy, let's celebrate. But his plan was never for them to settle forever. It was to settle and then get back to pushing forward and taking the rest of the land. God said, let's take a temporary rest to celebrate what we've accomplished so far. Then we're going to get back to work. God doesn't expect us to work all the time. God is the one that created the Sabbath. God doesn't expect us to be workaholics and work ourselves to death. He expects us to take short breaks and to celebrate victories, to regroup, to refresh. But he doesn't expect for us to get comfortable and settle in for life. There's always more work that needs to be done in the kingdom. God's plan was for them to take a short rest, then get back to taking over the land. But instead, they settled. They built their houses. They moved in their families. They started raising their crops and taking care of their livestock. And they got so settled that they never went back to claim the rest of the promise that God had given them. And unfortunately, because they didn't finish the job that God had given them, the job that they had originally set out to do, it kept coming back to haunt them for the rest of their existence. Those territories they didn't take, the people from those territories, from those nations, kept coming against them. They had to keep fighting, but they were fighting in defense when they could have been enjoying peace because they had finished the job. By the way, this wasn't the first time the Israelites settled for something less than what God had for them. God had given the land of Canaan to them through their father Abraham 600 years earlier. During a famine, the Israelites moved to Goshen, just outside of Egypt, because Joseph was going to provide food for them during the famine. But it was supposed to be a temporary place. God said, go ahead and move there for this time, but I will move you back to Canaan. That's your land. But they got comfortable in Egypt. They said, we like it here. Let's just stay here. Now, throughout Israel's history, we see times when the Israelites were taken captive by nations and turned into slaves because of their disobedience to God. Have you ever wondered why they became slaves in Egypt? At that period of their life, they really weren't being disobedient. They were still serving God to the best of their ability. But in a way, they were being disobedient because they had settled and weren't even interested in going back to Canaan. I believe that the reason God allowed them to become slaves was because he had to make them uncomfortable. He had to make them decide, you know what, maybe we'd be better off going back home, and it worked. It says that as their slavery kept becoming more and more intense, they finally began to cry out to God for deliverance. It wasn't until the pain of what they had there became so great that they even remembered there's a better place that we could be. Often we know that we really aren't where we're supposed to be, but this is bearable. I like it. And until the pain of staying where we are becomes greater than the pain of not being where we're supposed to be, we stick to what's comfortable. It might be good, but it's not great. It's not best. The third group of people I want to talk about today is trailblazers. Now, you're not actually going to find that word in the Bible. Wandering or wanderers, you find that word, and settlers, you find that word. And I probably could have used a word like pioneers or something else, but trailblazers is the word that kind of came to me. So that's what we're going with this morning. Trailblazers have a dream, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to see that dream come to pass. They know exactly where they're headed. They may not know exactly what's in store for them there, but if the vision comes from God, they just step out and say, okay, God promised it, and I believe his promises, so I'm going to follow God until I get the fullness of that. They keep their eye on the goal, and they know that anything worth having will take sacrifice and work. They refuse to settle completely until the job is finished. Abraham was the first trailblazer in the history of Israel. He was settled and happy in Haran. He was surrounded by family. He had a good life. But he left his comfort zone and hit the road for something that he had not yet seen. All he had was a promise from God. He didn't even know exactly where he was going. God never said, this is it. God didn't get out a map and say, that's what it is. He didn't look up pictures on Google and say, look, this is what all God said was, I want to take you to a better place. So Moses left his family, probably left a lot of his belongings behind. He said, I'm not going to settle here when God's made a promise for something better. And because he sacrificed everything and continued to follow God, he eventually got to the place that God had promised him. Back to the story of Joshua. My hero in the story of Joshua is Caleb. Caleb was a trailblazer. Caleb was around the same age as Joshua, probably just a couple of years less. At the point that I'm going to be talking about this story, Joshua is 88 years old, we're told. Caleb now is 85 years old. Other than Joshua, Caleb was the only person over age 60 that actually entered the promised land because God made everyone else wander until they were gone. He promised that they would be the only ones to enter because they were the only ones that trusted God. Caleb, at this point, is in his mid-80s, but he's not ready to settle yet. Joshua is doing what God said to do. God says, divide up the land, give the inheritances, let the people start to settle, then we'll get back to doing the task that we came to do. We'll take the rest of the land. Joshua is getting ready to reward Caleb and give him a piece of land that has already been conquered. Caleb can settle and enjoy the last few years of his life. But look at what Caleb says in verse 7 of chapter 14. He says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report. But my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. I didn't listen to the naysayers. I didn't let my eyes deceive me. I stood on God's promises. That's what he's saying here. So on that day, Moses solemnly promised me, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land, and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise. Even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I am 85 years old. I am as strong now as I will when Moses sent me on that journey. Wouldn't you love to be able to say that? 45 years later, at 85, I'm still as strong as I was at age 40. I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land just as the Lord said. God had promised Caleb a certain piece of land. Caleb knew which piece of land was supposed to be his. And now at 85 years old, he says, I'm not going to settle for this. This land you want to give me might be good land. Yes, we've already defeated the enemy in that land, but that's not the land that God promised me. God said I could have that land. And I might be 85 years old, but I'm not settling until I can settle in the fullness of what God promised me. If anyone should be ready to settle and simply enjoy the rest of his life, it should be Caleb. But Caleb said, I refuse to settle for anything less than everything God has for me. I will continue the fight until I have driven out every last enemy from my portion of Canaan. Caleb refused to settle for part of the promise. He wouldn't give up until the job was complete. He refused to settle for good enough. He wanted everything that God had. How often do we stop and settle and say, this is good? I had hopes for something better. I think God really wanted me to have something better, but I'm tired. I'm going to stop and I'm going to settle here. My third point today is, will we stop short of the full promise? Or will we continue to do the job until it's done? In the first chapter of Joshua, God is essentially renewing his covenant with Israel. It's been 40 years since they last heard it. He says it's time now to stop wandering. And to those who had decided to settle, he said, it's time to stop settling. I have the land that I promised you still waiting for you. Are you ready to fight for it? He gives the charge first to Joshua, and then Joshua passes it on to the people. I believe that God is ready to move us into a new season at Central Assembly. A lot of us have been wandering for a while. After this past 9 months, all of us might feel like we've been wandering, like we've been going around in circles and not accomplishing anything. And remember, sometimes God allows that because He's trying to get our attention. We're still following God, but it seems like we've been going in circles. I think a lot of what happened this last 9 months has been God's wake-up call to the church. In fact, I know it's been God's wake-up call for the church because God told me in the prophecy that He gave me in October. He said, I have allowed your churches to close as a wake-up call. If you still haven't received a copy of that prophecy, you can catch it on Facebook. We have it posted there when I gave it, or you can contact us. We'll send you a written copy of that because this prophecy and the things that God continues to speak to me are how I'm moving forward with Central Assembly and in my own life. I can't look at what everybody else is doing or look at what I think should be done. I've got to stand on what God tells me, and God clearly told me this is a wake-up call. Many of us had become too comfortable and settled into a routine, or we were simply wandering around, not really knowing what we were doing, just doing whatever came up. We were just going through the motions of church, just doing what we've been doing for years. But we were really in maintenance mode, just trying to keep it going. No real vision for what God had in store. Do you remember what it was like when you first came to Christ? Do you remember how excited you were at that point in your life? Do you remember how motivated you were to fulfill the Great Commission? Do you remember how much vision you had for the future? God wants to give us that again. He isn't promising easy, but He is promising blessing and success. But to get everything that God has for us, we're going to have to step out of our comfort zone. We're going to have to get out of our settlement. We're going to have to take risks, think outside of the box, and dream again. God is ready to give us new territory in our church and in our own spiritual lives. God's saying what He said through Joshua, get ready to move into your promise. That promise that you used to have, that faith, that hope that you used to have. Get ready to possess that because we're going to get moving again. But it takes God leading and us following. Get ready to move in to your promise. Get ready to move in and possess all, not part, but all that I have for you. About a year ago, I started feeling that God was telling me something needs to change. We keep doing the same things over and over. A lot of those, because that's what's been passed down to us. This is the way that the church has done them for years. And we've just continued to do things, but we're not getting the results. Usually not even getting the results that we used to get from doing those same things because society has changed. And we're trying to do things the way they've always been done, and society's moved beyond that. We understand that our mission is to win people for Christ. The Great Commission, the last command that Jesus gave, go into the whole world and make disciples. That is our task, and we believe that. Our job as a church is to win people. And yet, how many people have actually been won to Christ? Most of what we do is maintaining what we have, keeping the programs alive for us so we can learn. But it's never going out there and really fulfilling the job that God gave us to do. For the past several decades, the church in America has been losing ground. 80% of the churches in America are dying, declining, or stagnant in their growth. That wasn't God's plan. 50% of the churches in America that existed 50 years ago no longer exist. Why? Well, it's because most of us have just been doing things the way they've always been done. Some of the things we're still doing, we don't even know why we're doing it. It's just that's what we grew up with. That's what they used to do. We don't even understand what the purpose of those things was. And a lot of them, as I already said, they had a purpose when they were started, but the original purpose we're not even doing anymore because we've adapted the program to take care of us. Some of our methods and programs worked years ago, but they stopped working years ago. We just keep the programs because we're comfortable with them. We don't have to think. We just keep going through the motions. We just keep repeating what we've done hundreds of times before. Meanwhile, the true mission of God, to preach the gospel to the whole world, isn't happening. It's happening in our churches, but we're not reaching the whole world. The last part of the prophecy that God gave me in October said, you want to go back to normal. I have never been a God of normal. I am a God of miracles, a God of the supernatural. God wants so much more for us than what we've had in our churches. God says, that's not church. That's not what I designed. That's what you want. But I want more. I want to see miracles. I want to see supernatural things happening. But it's going to take work. It's going to take you seeking, getting on your faces before me. It's going to take investment. It's not just going to happen. I think normal is a synonym for settled. Normal is doing the same thing the same way just because. I think God's saying, forget the old normal. That might have been normal for you. Forget the old normal. Let's create a new normal, a better normal. Around February of last year, I was talking to Steve Shoup. Most of you know him. And found that he was feeling exactly the same way that I did. He was feeling like the church, for the most part, is just wandering or just settled in and going through motions, and we're not really accomplishing the Great Commission anymore. Since then, we found that there are several other pastors who feel the same way. They're feeling there's got to be more to this. We're tired of just doing it the same old way. We need to start listening to God and be willing to change some things so that we can actually fulfill the purpose that God gave us to fulfill. So several of us joined together through this time of pandemic and time of not being able to do a lot of normal stuff. And we've had some meetings, some on Zoom and some in person. And we've been talking about how to create a new normal. And what does that normal look like? What does God say normal should look like? We don't have all the answers yet. But we are confident that God isn't done with our churches, and that our future is going to be greater than anything that has happened in the past. Yes, some great things happened in the past, but God isn't done yet. He's got better things in store. All we know is that we're not going to wander in circles, and we're not going to settle. It's not that everything we had was bad, but God has something new. He has something better. We as leaders are ready to take possession of the land that God has given us. And we're giving the invitations to our people, just like Joshua gave the invitation to his people. God has great things in store for us, but it's going to require movement. It's going to require action. It's going to require work. We need to roll up our sleeves and say, okay, I've been settled long enough. It's time for me to get back in the game. The task has still not been completed, and I am going to move forward with God until the whole vision of God has been completed. It's time to leave the past and embrace something new. It's time to get up and get moving